Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's good to be back, man.
You're
Happy
always laughing
Tuesday,
when we come in, like we just had a really funny joke in the back.
dude. I have so much fucking fun with these intros. I think I never know what you pick, and it's always exactly what I want.
I do like that about it.
It's
Just a
always
little
fun.
bit of mystery is always good.
I don't know. I'm always like a little bit drowsy by this time on Tuesday, not because like I'm not excited, but it's been a long day, and that always gets me
Shit,
going.
yeah.
Gets me going on a Tuesday, which as we are here, it is weekly whiskey on Tuesday night. So thanks for joining us, everybody. If you're drinking something awesome, if you're drinking something just fine, if you're drinking iced tea, let us know in the comments here. We have a great guest tonight, but before we get there, we've got a little bit of news to do. You might have noticed that we took last week off. It was the weekly whiskey summer vacation. Once again, I was bad.
First of two.
First of two. Oh, that's right. Yeah, we
It's
have
okay.
a secondary vacation coming up, but
We'll figure that out later.
just a short one. But I was jet setting. I was off in Seattle after a long trip to Kentucky, and I'm back now. So that's a good time. We had a little flight delay, but you're not here to hear about my travels. You're here to hear about the barrel program, which is super cool. I know earlier in the week I sent out an email that we were going to have 3 barrels this week and 3 barrels next week. That was actually a bold-faced lie because we're doing 3 barrels this week and we're doing 6 barrels next week. So
A good type
9.
of lie.
Yeah. I try and under promise over deliver. So we'll be doing 9 barrels between this week and next. If you're curious, 2 Whistle Pig cast strength rye. We've got a Starlight. We've got a Nulu. We've got, I want to say, a Knob Creek bourbon with a Knob Creek rye close behind. I've got word that our Kentucky Spirit is almost done. And on top of that, we have a surprise or two, not last of which is the Old Forester single barrel proof bourbon, the Forester and Flame. So keep
That's
an eye on
not a
your email.
surprise now that you said it.
Well, I mean, that was only 7. There's 2 more. I'm not going to give them all away.
Okay, good.
But it's going to be a busy week. So your inbox is going to hurt, but it's going to be worth it. So keep an eye on your inbox. Lots of barrels coming down the pipe. Things are arriving left and right. It's a good time to be summer. So hot girl summer in terms of bourbon and rye. But I think that sums it up. So how you doing, John?
I'm doing good. I don't think we're gonna make that cut. Count 40. Nice try.
I'm good with that.
Jay is an unabashed hater of the fantail.
God damn, it was the ugliest bottle I've ever seen. Doesn't fit anywhere.
Man. We don't need to go into it. Yeah, Spirits over here commenting on what's gonna happen to his bank account. Terribly sorry about that. Not that sorry though, actually. Let's see what else. Yeah, okay. I think that wraps up what everybody's got going on in the chat here. What do you say we tear into this?
Yeah, so we have a great guest with us tonight. We have been looking forward to this one for a very long time. Ever since I was on premise back in April, picked a barrel of rye. Could not wait. So without further ado, who are we talking to tonight, John?
Let's bring in our buddy here. We get Dr. Pat from Wilderness Trail and from Ferm Solutions.
Hot diggity.
Dr. Pat, how are you?
Good. How you guys tonight?
Man, can't complain. Drinking whiskey on a Tuesday. So
yeah, we've got it pretty rough.
It's good to see you. So for those who aren't aware, Dr. Pat is one of the dynamic duo behind the success at Wilderness Trail. Joined by his side is, I believe, Shane Baker, right?
Yep.
Shane Baker. Okay, cool. See, I can remember things. But we are here with Dr. Pat tonight. So tell us a little bit. What is your duty here at Wilderness Trail? Or I guess there at Wilderness Trail. I wish it was here, but it's there.
Yeah, well, I ask myself that every day because my job changes. I mean, it seems like every minute there's something different going on. So if there's ever, I mean, if I try to define what I do, then it changes so quickly. But, over the last, Ferm Solutions has been in business almost 15 years now, and Wilderness Trail is in its 8th year of distilling. And so, we've kind of gone from doing everything ourselves to now we've got a staff of over, somewhere around 60 people.
Oh, wow.
That, really do a good job of taking care of everything. And so, these days we're able to kind of get out and support the brand more and, be a little more flexible outside of having to, be such a flat organization. Now we're, got good people to help get things done. So we're kind of doing everything we want to do now.
Wow.
That's
60.
cool.
I did not realize you guys had expanded personnel quite that far. That's crazy.
Yeah, let's dig into that a little bit. So you guys are in your 8th year of distilling now at Wilderness Trail. Can you kind of take the clocks back a little bit for us and rewind us back to the earlier days on sort of where you. I guess we could go all the way back to Ferm Solutions first if you want to, and just kind of give us the intro there. Like, what was maybe even before day one? What was like the day zero conversation of let's do this? I mean, you went from being a professor to kicking this thing off, correct?
Yep, that's right. So, my background is in microbiology, biochemistry. Shane, his background, he's a mechanical engineer, but he's also got a lot of business experience. He worked for several Fortune 500 companies and was actually in venture capital. So he was, very in tune with raising capital and starting businesses, as well as, how do you go in and restructure a business that's not doing so well to, sell it like a venture capital type of deal. So him and I met back in the 90s through a mutual friend of ours who was a drummer. Shane's a guitar player. I'm a lead singer. So our drummer buddy connected us and we started a band, and we played in rock band for several years and played locally and different things. And so that's how I got, to know Shane. And then I moved away from here to become a medical microbiology professor. And I was about 3 hours east of here in Pikeville, Kentucky. And started, and there's a lot of moonshining over there and different things. So we started doing some consulting for companies that kind of do what Ferm Solutions does, which it sells yeast, enzymes, and does technical support for distilleries and breweries. And, one thing about being a yeast provider is the yeast gets the blame for every problem that a distillery or a brewery has. So if you're going to sell yeast and be successful, you got to be ready to be that first responder on getting the phone call of, hey, man, how come this damn yeast isn't working?
Yeah. 911 Yeast, how can we help you?
Yeah, exactly. It is like that. So, just kind of organically, we became troubleshooters of the industry. So we're one of only a couple companies in the world that when distilleries have major issues, including any of the big bourbon producers or fuel alcohol distilleries. I mean, there's thousands of distilleries and thousands of breweries. And we even do a lot of work in non-alcoholic fermented beverages like kombucha and other things. Anything that's got to do with fermentation will, we have the knowledge to help. But most of our business is with distilled spirits, fuel alcohol, and like hard seltzer now is a big thing. Beer production, obviously, there's a lot of facets of it. So, we were successful with that company. And, at some point we were kind of at the stage to where, we had paid down our debt. We owned the building, where inventory's paid for. We're starting to get to the point where we could take some cash out of the business. And, we're sitting here taking phone calls from some of the most famous master distillers in the world, helping them with their problems. And we just kind of looked at each other and was like, I think we know what we can do with our money is we'll start our own damn distillery. So we started Wilderness Trail back in 2012, started distilling in 2013. And then so we started a 1 barrel a day operation on a 250 gallon pot still. And again, we just simply wanted to have a distillery. We thought this will really help strengthen our skill set by actually running a distillery of our own. It'll be something, a lot of our customers, we do a lot of training. So we could bring people in instead of just whiteboarding things out in the Ferm Solutions lecture hall. We can actually have people training on real equipment and, in the distillery. Then, a couple years into that, we're like, okay, 1 barrel a day it's a nice little thing, but we need to take this thing up to the next level. About that time, that's when bourbon boom was really, really hitting. That's when all the big guys, no more production for anybody else. We're making our own stuff. Everybody's doubling down on capacity. So we kind of saw an opportunity to take on some contract production that some of the big guys weren't doing anymore. And at that same time, you had labeling requirements where, people were, kind of going away from Indiana juice, MGP and stuff, and in favor of Kentucky juice. And so we expanded our distillery. We took it up to about a 15 barrel a shift operation. And then we ran on one shift 5 days a week for a while like that. And I think we ended up putting back a couple thousand barrels a year instead of, 250 barrels a year. And then we just kind of saw, hey, man, this contract thing's getting out of control and our brand is kicking up. So we need more capacity. So our last expansion, which was completed in the summer of 2018, took us to 220 barrels a day, 7 days a week. So
Damn.
we went from 1 barrel a day operation 7-8 years ago to the 14th largest bourbon producer in the world, and just became the 18th member of the Kentucky Bourbon Trail.
Oh
Yeah,
man.
shit, you're making in one day what you're making in 1 year.
Oh yeah, that means
That's
we're having to
crazy.
build the same amount of barrel warehouses that we had to build in a year in a day now. So
Oh man.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, that's
That'll keep you
only
busy.
that's only a couple barrels off of what like Bullet over in Shelbyville's doing, which is a big commercial operation. So that's quite the growth trajectory.
oh yeah, some people it takes 150 years to get there. It took us 7 years. So I'm not complaining.
Man.
That's
So-
amazing.
You've been distilling this stuff for 8 years. Do you guys have any of that stuff kicking around? Maybe experimental barrels or anything that's coming up on 8 years? I know that you've got 6-year product hitting the shelves now. Is there anything older than that kicking around in the back of the warehouse that you guys are still tinkering with?
I mean, we got barrels that are almost 8 years old now. So
Okay, no kidding.
I mean, we got a good long plan. I mean, we'll have 10-year at 10-year, 12-year at 12-year. I mean, I want to see some Wilderness 12-year sitting on the shelf next to Weller 12.
Yes, please.
And then we got plans to go on. Our kids will be drinking 25-year 1 year, maybe one time, maybe.
That
Man,
could be cool.
now that's childcare right there. That's a good plan.
Yeah.
I'm curious, where did the name Wilderness Trail come from? I have an inkling, but I'm curious, what led you guys to name the operation that?
Yep. Well, our phone book actually says Wilderness Trace on it. And we started off being called Wilderness Trace. We didn't think it'd be any big deal, but apparently
Somebody else didn't like it.
We abruptly, yeah, somebody else had a couple extra more $1 billion than we did. So we just, resolved that by changing it to Trail. And actually the Wilderness Trace, the Wilderness Trail, the Wilderness Road, it's actually a real thing that comes right through Danville. It's actually a road that early settlers and pioneers like Daniel Boone would have brought people to settle this area. And it basically goes right through Danville and then splits and goes to Fort Boonesboro, Kentucky, and then on up to Louisville. So it's a real thing, and it came right through Danville. And so we just named our distillery after there's actually about 9 businesses around here called Wilderness Trace Child Development Center and Wilderness Trace Veterinary Clinic and all these different things. So I don't know how creative it was for us to come up with that, but it just seemed kind of cool, and then paying homage to the Wilderness Trail here in our area.
Okay, that's cool, because I always think, you're around Louisville, you're around Lexington, even Frankfort and stuff. But once you really start to head to Danville, you kind of get that wilderness feel back a little bit. Not to say there's not a lot going on in Danville, but after you leave the city, it very much feels like the wilderness at times when you're starting to pop out and see those Wilderness Trail rick houses over on the horizon.
Oh yeah, you keep going an hour and a half south of here where I grew up, and you really start getting into it. That's where I honed my linguistic skills over the years. So. Plays in my favor a lot, though, too. The kind of the dumbest guy in the room thing, who's actually probably got more sense than anybody.
Yeah, the guy's actually a doctor.
Yeah, exactly. That hillbilly over in the corner there.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, Wilderness Trail is absolutely worth a visit. If you go, it's definitely worth the drive. It's not a 20-minute hop down the highway, but an hour, I want to say hour 20 or so later, you're definitely rewarded and stopping by. But so you guys, what was your original mash bill? What did you guys originally start distilling with? Or did you kind of start with all the mash bills you're working with today?
No, I mean, we had a plan to make multiple mash bills, but to start with, we just kind of wanted, what do we like drinking? And we're big weeder fans. And the other thing is, wheat grows well around here, and we wanted to showcase Kentucky grown grains. And so wheat was just a very logical thing for us, being that that's what we liked and that's what they grow around here. The rye bourbon and the rye whiskey didn't come for another year later because it took us that long to source locally grown rye. So all of our barley, we purchase it from out of state currently, but all of our corn, wheat, and rye we get locally here. And it is, something, in the case of the rye, it's something that we actually had to work with the farmers to grow specific varieties that grow well here. And my background, my PhD is actually in plant pathology. So I've got a good bit of knowledge of diseases of field crops, how field crops grow and that kind of stuff. And one of the big challenges with growing rye in Kentucky is actually the plant diseases that occur on it. So we're able to actually help work with our farmers and pick a variety that worked well for us. And we're one of the only, I mean, most Kentucky distilleries use rye in their recipes. We're one of only probably 2 or 3 in the state that use Kentucky grown rye.
Really? Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually interested there. So it seems like there's some symbiotic relationship. Like you guys actually have some information and knowledge. Are you guys helping out the farmers as well? Or did, you just kind of instruct them like, these are the rye we know.
Yep.
This is what you want.
Yeah, we work with like agricultural extension through the university, not only the University of Kentucky, where Shane and I both graduated, but also other states, depending on what type of knowledge we're looking for. We've got a pretty extensive network of, people at that level that, we need to tap into that kind of network. We have that at our fingertips. So it's definitely been helpful.
Okay, cool. And at this point, I feel like John and I need to make a trip to UK over there. We were, we had Maker's Mark on just a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about their UK collaboration and working on, conservation and their, I forget what was it the
Their
oak repository?
genome.
Yeah,
Yeah,
oak
they're building
genome
an
project.
oak repository over there and studying the American oak, and they're doing some pretty cool stuff with that for sure. It's good to see a lot of two-way streets being formed here. You start paving that each way from the distillery and back to it. And I think it benefits everybody right down to the consumer. So it's really good to see that come full circle too.
Well, I mean, if you look at grain, just looking at grain and how impactful a distillery can be to a community. When we first started, we were grinding 820 pounds of grain a day. We do 180,000 pounds a day, 7 days a week now. So
Wow.
It's like, and that takes a lot of planning. And that's where Shane really is good at, working with our team to forecast. I mean, you don't just go to a farm and say, hey, starting tomorrow, I need 1 million pounds of grain every week. It doesn't work that way. So there's a lot of forecasting. Same with barrels. You don't just go to Independent Stave or whatever and say, hey guys, I need 70,000 barrels. I'll take my first truckload tomorrow. So it takes a lot of forecasting, a lot of planning to build up to that. But the impactfulness to the community, I mean, the main farm that we work with here, I don't know how many millions of dollars worth of infrastructure improvements that they had to do just to be able to keep up with what we're doing. And it's super helpful for them because they're transporting that grain 5 miles instead of to a elevator in Louisville, for example. And we work really closely with them when they're harvesting a certain grain. We're going to be distilling that grain. That way we're not just stockpiling grain bins full of stuff. We're going to be using it as quickly as we can as they're producing it to help free up space. So we coordinate all that.
Wow. I knew that a lot of grain goes into whiskey, and that's like something you always see, right? Like first stop in the distillery tour, like, hey, here's a grain, here's a silos. I didn't realize it was 180,000 pounds a day. Like that's a lot. I mean, there's no other way to say it. That's a fuck ton of grain.
Yeah.
So do they work with other distillers? Or are you pretty much their primary client at this point? Like that is a huge scale up at least in, terms of just overall quantity.
Well, especially for a region that's not really known for growing a lot of rye, right? I mean, that's a heavy load.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Okay. But I mean, it makes sense. 5 miles is definitely different than 75 miles up to Louisville, 65.
It's probably about 100. Yeah. It takes me about an hour and a half to get there.
All right. Shows how often I make that drive, but cool. I mean, that's crazy. I knew that rye was becoming a big part of the portfolio, but it's cool to see, the development that Wilderness Trail is pushing in the area as well. So you guys I know you have wheated bourbon, you have high rye bourbon, you have your straight rye. Do you have a favorite that you like to work with? Is one of these more difficult on the actual distillation fermentation side? Once you've gone through the pain of sourcing it and bringing it in?
Well, I mean, you can ask any distiller what their opinion is on rye, and they'll start kind of, oh God, So rye is more abrasive to your equipment. It is harder to mill. So whenever we're milling that rye, we have to slow down our feed to the mills. So there's that kind of thing. There's also foaming issues that occur with rye that we don't normally have to worry about. I remember the first time we ran some high rye and really just weren't even thinking about foaming at all. And I went past the fermenter and I was like, oh man, that thing is really bubbling. And I took a picture of it thinking this would be a great picture to show for training of, bubbling. And then just as I was sitting there with my camera in my hand, it just came up and over the top. And it didn't stop. Well, I think when that damn thing was done foaming, the tank had 7 foot of empty headspace in it. So and that was a 4,000 gallon fermenter. So once we put our 20,000 gallon fermenters in, we're like, man, we got to get this damn foaming under control. So we use food grade anti-foams. we'll cut back the gravity on those batches. We'll create a little more head space to allow for expansion. We have agitation in our large fermenter, so we'll run our agitators. There's a bunch of different things you can do. There's some enzymes that you can use to mitigate foaming. So we kind of take a multi-step approach to preventing that.
I see. That reminds me, down in Mexico, one of my favorite non-whiskey spirits is agave spirits, and the distillers hate working with the jabalí maguey of agave because it foams so much, and it just foams everywhere. And by the time it's done, there's just foam everywhere, and it looks like an old Japanese game show. So it's funny to hear. Do you have all 20,000 gallon fermenters now, or do you kind of have a blend of volumes in construction?
Well, we're basically, technically 3 separate functional distilleries at our site. So we got a small distillery, which is the 250 gallon pot still. And the thing about that system, we got an extra rectification column, so we can actually make vodka on that. We can make rum on that. We can make bourbon on that, depending on how we run those rectification columns. And then the 2 column stills that we have an 18-inch diameter Vendome column still, and then a 36-inch diameter column still. So the 18 runs off of 6 4,000 gallon fermenters, and the 36 runs off 6 20,000 gallon fermenters.
Damn.
Okay.
20,000 gallon fermenter will get you about 60 barrels of bourbon at 110 proof.
Okay, so that makes sense how you're making up to about that 240, 250 a day.
Mm-hmm.
I guess 220. But
about 215, 220.
Okay, very cool. It's kind of cool. So are you pretty much just using that 36? Are you doing a little product mix on all 3?
We're running full time on both our 18 and our 36.
Okay.
And it's cool that we have that comparison, because we get a lot of customers that, hey man, I'm getting ready to switch from a pot still to a column still. What's that going to do to my product? And we can kind of take them through our history of, the bottles that I'm seeing now in the store. If you look at the fine print, we put a lot of information on the side of our bottles here.
Yeah.
So like we put the mash bill on there, but it'll say copper pot distilled. Well, nowadays, if you look at that, a lot of them say copper column distilled, because we're getting over into our column. So just little nuances like that.
Huh.
You'll start seeing little changes, and nobody's really in barrel picks. That's a good opportunity for us to start mingling some column stuff on there. And half the time people are picking pot still, half of the time they're picking column still. So we're getting really good consistency from going from a pot to a column. But that helps us to explain to our customers. Same thing with going from a 4,000 gallon fermenter to a 20,000 gallon fermenter. What does that do to my flavor? Going from an 18-inch column to a 36-inch column. So it's just more information that we have to, when we're talking to people about these things, we can answer their questions, and we've got experience backing it up.
That's pretty cool. Actually, I have a copper pot rye here. And I know we picked, I believe, a copper pot earlier in the year too.
Let's see what mine is here.
I never picked up on the difference of still on the side. That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
it's
copper pot, but
okay.
Yeah, this is copper pot distill as well. You guys also deserve a hell of a lot of credit for what you put on the bottle, what it tells us as the consumer. I didn't pick this barrel. I'm not part of the club that picked it. I had a buddy in another state who said, "Hey, I've got 2 of these. Do you want one?" And without even knowing any of the details, like, well, shit, yeah, I want one. And he set it up. I tried it. I was like, oh, this is awesome. I like this. And rather than have to go start doing a bunch of Google foo and try to track everything down, I could just look right on the bottle and say, oh, this is the mash bill. This is the yeast strain. This is the barrel. Like, you give us all the nerdy stats that we want. And I want to pump your tires for that, because I think it's freaking great, and not enough people do it.
That's our day job, is telling everybody everything we know and everything we do to help them run their distilleries right. So why wouldn't we do that for our whiskey drinking customers? And we're bourbon fans. We started off bourbon fans, before we even we're for sure going to do a distillery. So we want to see all that, and there's really no reason in our minds why you wouldn't. The only reason why, a lot of places don't do that is because either A, they don't know that information, or B, they're where they're sourcing it from changes so frequently that information wouldn't be static over time.
Right.
So, it's just, we're happy to provide that information, and people love it, and we're happy to, we're like super transparent. Anything you want to know, any of the yeast strains we use for our whiskeys, you can go to our Ferm Solutions website and order any of them right now.
Really?
Cool.
To the viewing audience.
That's kind of cool. I assumed, when we were talking about Ferm Solutions, you guys had like the yeast for everybody, and then like you guys had your own like little like this is our yeast. I don't know if people really bond to yeast strains, but I kind of assumed you guys had like your own little personal stash of yeast.
No, we market all the strains we use in our distillery. We make, and we, hey, you want to know what's in this bottle here? Well, you can get that exact yeast strain. And that, again, that's just part of being transparent. And I mean, we want people to succeed. We want people to, if you like our product and you want to use the same yeast because you like our product, I mean, that's kind of a compliment. So we're happy to provide that.
Oh, that's great. I mean, in an industry where it seems like you there's not a lot of middle ground, right? Like you either have super opaque and people who don't want to give any shred of, indication on what they're doing because of, market intelligence and business competition. It's nice to see folks on the, the extremely transparent side of things.
100%.
I like it, especially in American whiskey. American whiskey is getting less opaque, I think, as time goes on because the nerds, I think, are kind of taking over, which is great. So,
yes, we have.
I love it. And honestly, go ahead, John. You're good.
I was gonna say, like, I want to take one more step back. You told us earlier, kind of the beginning of Ferm Solutions and the distillery itself. Let's talk a little bit more about your evolution as a whiskey drinker. Where did you kind of come into the whiskey world? Was it bourbon? Was it rye? What was it? A brand that brought you to the table? Just kind of give us a little background on your history with whiskey.
Well, probably some of the first whiskey that I ever remember having. I remember when I was about 8 years old, I was a ring bearer at one of my cousin's wedding, and somehow back then they had a whiskey sour fountains, and I ended up getting into one of them, and I think I got a little sick.
Whoops!
But that was one of my first forays into it. But kind of getting into the legal years of it. It was probably things like Kentucky Gentleman, Mellow Corn. I mean, we used to think Mellow Corn, it was the cheapest stuff around. I mean, and this is back in the 80s and in the 90s. And it was the cheapest stuff you could get. But nowadays, those bottles would be coveted if you had those little or whatever. I mean, here we were just in the heyday of it. I mean, there was Pappy on the shelf. And I remember when Pappy 23 hit $350 a bottle on the secondary market. I'm like, hell, I'm out. Forget about that shit.
Little did you know.
Little did I know.
Yeah, really.
Oh, that's crazy. So, all right. So just as someone who's currently planning a wedding, so you said a whiskey sour fountain?
Yep. I don't think those things are legal anymore because I haven't seen any. I think it's just too
many 8-year-olds getting involved with them.
Exactly. But I remember back in the 70s and the 80s, those were a staple, at least my family's weddings.
Oh, shit. All right. Well, me and my engineering degree are going to be off in the corner here. That changes some things for me. I didn't know that was everything.
Yeah. But once I started getting into actually quality whiskeys, once I've kind of got to the point to where I wasn't eating Hamburger Magic instead of Hamburger Helper. And when I switched from being able to drink Bud Light instead of Natural Light, that's like a transition of life of, man, I've hit the big time now. So I was, able to get things, some of the better stuff, the really good weeders and, different things that are coveted now. So, I mean, and again, that's one of the reasons we started making wheat is because we really liked like Weller and that type of stuff.
Certainly.
Maker's Mark's always been a staple. I mean, you can get it anywhere. It's usually pretty consistent, and it's a good example of a wheated bourbon.
Yeah, I'd sign off on that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, awesome. We're kind of coming up on the top of our time. We got a few more minutes, but yeah. So you kind of talked about it a little bit. I'm curious. We always like to ask people what they like to drink. When they're not drinking their own stuff, and it may be like picking your own child. But if you had to pick one bottling that you guys have produced, and it was only that, and you can only make that for the rest of the time, what would that be? What's kind of your golden goose? Maybe not in market and sales, but just what do you enjoy making the most?
It would be our wheated bourbon, just because, that's our first one we ever made. And we made it because that's what we liked. But I mean, on a day-to-day basis, I drink, the wheated and the high rye bourbon pretty much interchangeably. A lot of people don't realize that those two bourbons have the exact same mash recipe, except one's got wheat and one's got rye. So, whenever you're looking at, I mean, that's a really important thing for a lot of people to understand. What's the difference between a wheated bourbon and a rye bourbon? So if you go down here to the store and buy a bottle of Maker's Mark for your wheated, and then go buy a bottle of Buffalo Trace for your rye bourbon, you're going to be comparing apples to oranges. Right. So this is one distillery. The grains are sourced from similar farms, the same equipment, same yeast strain. So it's a real good example of a wheated bourbon versus a high rye bourbon. That, you know, the only thing different is one's got the 24% wheat, one's got 24% rye.
Okay. Very cool. I like it. Another question I meant to ask is when we're going to see, you know, if we're ever going to see Wilderness Trail 12 or 10, but you answered that early on. You know, we're going to see that someday,
Yeah,
which I'm excited
you
about.
would pull the carpet right out from under our feet on that one. We were teeing that up for you. We're like, okay, we'll get him right here. He's going to give us some answer.
Oh, yeah.
I like it. That's great. I mean, I love what you guys are doing. Your Riot 4 is incredible. You know, your weeded. We were in there pulling some of your, you know, your Derby gift shop bottles, you know, around the 6-year mark. I want to say, I think those are drinking really well. So yeah, I mean, I think it only is going to get better. It's certainly not bad now. It's drinking really nicely. So 4, 6, 10 years, 20 years.
Yeah,
Some
we're
good
real,
stuff.
we're really happy where it's gone.
Cool. Well, I'll hit you with one final one. I love to throw this out there, and if you don't have it, it's cool. But being, you know, a fermentation expert, someone with you know, plant and pathology and biology, you know, what is your weirdest fact about yeast that people don't understand? What is some, you know, if you're walking up to someone in the bar and you needed that one bar trivia point about yeast that no one in the room is going to know, what weird quirky piece of info do you have for us?
Well, there's a lot of different things. You know, one thing relative to making bourbon that a lot of people, that I hear a lot of people talk about, you know, when you think about a sour mash versus a sweet mash, and, you know, we showcase sweet mash, which is where you start with all fresh water every time. You don't add any backset from a previous distillation, which would make it a sour mash. So a lot of people, when they, you know, why do distilleries use a sour mash? It's like, oh, because it's more consistent. And a lot of people have a misconception is that backset supplies some or all of the yeast for that next batch, and that's what makes it consistent. You know, you consider that material was 213 degrees at the bottom of the still. It's probably not a very good chance that any yeast is going to be alive in there. So that's kind of one thing that a lot of people just, in the same thing with, you know, when people say that backset makes the whiskey more consistent, I think what they really mean is, so using backset reduces the pH, and that's why they call it sour mash. And that pH reduction helps curb the potential for bacterial contamination. So I think when they say consistency, they mean we have more of a possibility of not having contamination if we do a backset. So I think that's really the best answer to me for why does it make it more consistent? Because the thing is, the reason we don't use backset is we're shooting for consistency. And when we look at the yeast and the grain and the water and our process on a day-to-day basis, everything is very consistent. Backset is not consistent. Unless every one of your batches are exactly the same, then your backset is not ever going to be the same. And then you got distillers that are run 24/7 versus distillers, their backset cools down before they get a chance to use it. And there's just all kinds of different things. So if your goal is to make a very consistent product, then our mentality is, why would we purposefully add a inherently inconsistent ingredient? And that would be the backset.
Interesting. Okay, that's really cool. That's something you know, everyone says, you know, sour mash helps kick off fermentation, you know, boosts efficiency, but really it's to help mitigate bacteria. Okay.
Contamination, yeah. And we're Ferm Solutions, so we don't have, I mean, we're the company that people come to when they need help with. We mitigate that by keeping a very clean distillery. And anybody that's ever been to our distillery, we get the comment all the time, it's so clean in here. It's like, we're making food here, folks. It should be clean.
Oh yeah.
Right. You know,
I mean, I would eat off of most of Wilderness Trail Distillery. Like,
yeah.
Even the parking lot, real clean.
Oh yeah.
Real nice.
I do all the time. Find a little half a chicken nugget out there.
Scoop that up, just a little road food. That's no big deal.
Who's that homeless guy out there eating off the parking lot?
Trunk charcuterie.
I had a question rolling here about the sweet mash. Do you also entirely sterilize your tanks and stills between each batch as you're doing that?
No, we don't sterilize, but we do steam clean out. We steam clean the lines, the piping, and the pumps going from our cooker tank to the ferm, and then also the fermenter. We steam it out, but it's by no means sterilized. Sterilization requires another component of pressure that we don't have there. So we're probably achieving more, something closer to a pasteurization rather than a sterilization. Sterilization kills 100% of everything. So we're not technically sterilizing. We're sanitizing with cleaning products and rinse water, and then we're using a steam to heat the tanks.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I just kind of assumed that sterilization meant really nice clean, but that's a good point.
Yeah, I hadn't realized the distinction between all of that. It makes sense, but
As a microbiologist, that's where training's in. What's the difference
something you
between
know about.
when you wash your hands? You're getting rid of most anything you want to have a problem with, but you're by no means eliminating 100% of anything.
Okay, and that makes sense. I mean, that 99.99% is not quite.
And 0.01% can become back 100% again if just a couple hours. So in the microbial world, replication occurs. Bacteria multiply every 15 to 20 minutes. Yeast replicate every hour and a half to 2.5 hours under optimum conditions. So, when you get bacterial issues, they can very quickly outrun the yeast because their doubling time is so much shorter.
Interesting. Now, how much yeast in terms of volume or weight does it take for one of your 20,000 gallon fermenters?
Well, we're going to use differing amounts of yeast depending on the yeast strain. So we have, when you look at why do distilleries use this strain or that strain, obviously everybody's interested in making a good tasting product, but there's also performance factors, like how much alcohol am I going to be making? Some yeast strains can't make more than 7% alcohol. Some yeast strains, like fuel alcohol producers, they're aiming for close to 20% alcohol by volume. We're normally hitting closer to 8.5%, 9%. It's not really hard to get those numbers. But the other thing you got to look at with yeast is performance variables like temperature tolerance. How quickly does it take to finish a fermenter? I mean, we've got strains that you could take 5 days in a fermenter. And if that's great and everything, if it makes good whiskey, but if I'm having to occupy a tank for nearly a week, whereas if I use a different strain, I can get 3.5 turns out of that tank in a week. It cuts down on the number of fermentation tanks that you have to have. So there's a lot of performance factors related to the yeast that are separate from flavor. I mean, obviously you're going to have a good flavored yeast, but there's all those performance variables and speed of fermentation and temperature tolerance are two of the big ones.
I see. So if we assume that you guys were using a 72-hour ferment for every single product you make, that would be incorrect?
That would be incorrect. We do now. We're going to vary our fermentation times depending on what our production rate is. So, for example, recently we just finished construction of another barrel warehouse, which is something we're building a 24,000 barrel. We're filling a 24,000 barrel house about once every 120, 130 days. So we've got to have them ready. So when we're getting kind of on the verge of holy shit, this one's almost full, and the next one's not. We don't have occupancy yet. We'll dial back our production. Okay, instead of 215 barrels a day, let's dial this thing back to 170 barrels a day so we don't fill our warehouse up before the next one's ready. So that's where how do we do that? We just extend our fermentation times. And that's helpful from a yield standpoint. Yield is the number of proof gallons that you get per bushel of grain. But, if we're waiting around another day to get 5 barrels when we could have started a new fermenter and got 25 barrels, there's sort of like production, how many barrels are you making? But then there's yield, how much whiskey are you making per amount of grain you're using? So sometimes you'll forego a few barrels here and there in the sake of getting big production.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I never really thought of the efficacy of it that way. How many strains of yeast are you guys tinkering with over there, Dr. Pat?
We estimate that we have about 9,000 different yeast strains. We only market about 30 of those between distilleries and breweries and hard seltzer producers and fuel alcohol. And be honest with you, out of those 9,000 strains, we probably only know a good bit of information of about less than 1,000 of those. I mean, we love to just sit around and learn stuff all day, but as a business and as entrepreneurs, we try to follow projects to where there's going to be dollar signs at the end of the rainbow. Naturally. So, and that's where we'll do collaborative research with, University of Kentucky. I mean, we do things, UC Berkeley. I mean, we're in all kinds of major universities. So when we come up with an idea that's like a cool idea from an information standpoint, we'll go to our academic partners and, the professors would be like, hey guys, here's the golden grail of an experiment you can do. You write the grant for it. We'll be the industrial collaborator on it. Here's pretty much the whole damn outline of it. They write the grant, which is what they're good at doing. They get funded, and then that funds graduate students. And so we're not having to do that work, but we collaboratively will learn from what gets for the information that comes out of it. So we're helping them. It's helping us. A lot of people, we talk about yeast, but there's a lot of other contaminating organisms that are in there. You're talking about, hey, this much corn, this much wheat, this yeast strain, this clear limestone water. Well, what about all the microorganisms that are in there that you didn't intentionally put in there? You're lucky to go to a distillery and them mention anything about the microflora of, a lot of times they call it house bugs. Oh yeah, we got the yeast, we got the grain, we got the water, and then we also have our own set of house bugs. And it's like, oh really? What are they? Well, hell, I don't know. They're just house bugs, I reckon. It's like, shit, man, if I had a multi-billion-dollar company, I'd be wanting to know that kind of information. So that's what we do for those distilleries, is help them understand, what else is in there besides what they intentionally put into there. Could be wild yeast in there. Could be a bacteria. I mean, you're going to have bacteria in almost every batch, no matter if you're cleaning and sterilizing everything. So you just don't want to get out of control. And the bacteria, I mean, when I say we had 9,000 yeast strains, we've got over 65,000 bacteria in our collection that we've cultured from distilleries all over the world. I mean, if you really want to crack the code on flavor from old Scotch and Irish whiskey distilleries, or some of the most famous really old bourbon producers, especially when you get into like cypress and wood tanks versus stainless steel, kind of older heat exchangers and things that promote bacterial contamination. You've got a whole bunch of organisms in there that you would have to consider if you want to duplicate their flavor profile. And, a lot of people, when they think about bacteria, they think, oh my God, it's a disease, but think about it in terms of like yogurt and those kind of things. And those are the types of bacteria that contaminate distilleries and breweries. In our Ferm Solutions business, early on, the whole reason we ever started saving those bacteria is because for fuel alcohol producers, which don't care anything about flavor, they're just trying to make as much alcohol as they can for as cheap as they can. We develop and market products that control bacterial contamination. So that's why we collect and study those organisms. Like, what are we even after here? What kills them? What prevents them from growing, et cetera, et cetera. So we started saving these, and then we got more over into beverage alcohol and started, okay, now we got flavor to consider. And, if you think of some of the most prominent chemicals that are in bourbon and other whiskeys, esters, about anybody can recognize that word, esters. Vanillin, there's, banana and clove and caramel and a lot of these other flavors. Those are directly from esters, and organic acids that are produced by yeast and bacteria condense with alcohols to form esters. So in the barrel aging process, some of those organic acids that would be produced by bacteria and the yeast and wild yeast would certainly later down the road be involved with chemical reactions that make some of those very complex flavors that you get in bourbon. And then, and just one last thing about the bacteria, we didn't realize it until we had a collection of like 50, 60,000, that all the bacteria that contaminate distilleries and breweries, that's the same ones they're selling as probiotics now. So we arguably have the world's largest repository of probiotic bacteria in the world. And now we're like chasing down medical companies. Like, hey man, we got this mega collection here. Let's make a little.
Look what we've got for you.
Oh, that's amazing. That's crazy. I mean, I expected big numbers. I expected like, oh, we have 500 yeasts, and I was like expected to be wowed by that. But holy shit, that's a lot of everything. That's a lot of yeast.
That's real talk.
Our buddy Lane, Spirit Surveyor, in the chat was wondering if you offer an additional nerdy version of tours, which sounds a lot to me like Lane would just kind of like to take you out to dinner sometime.
Yeah. I mean, we do, the Kentucky Distillers Association, they host the Kentucky Bourbon Affair. Yeah. And we hold, it's called, I think it's called Bourbon Science. And we take people in the lab. We do a lot of training. I teach a lot of classes at Moonshine University up in Louisville. I do a 2-day advanced fermentation class. Now, that's 16 hours, a little more than just a tour's worth of information. But there's things like that we do, and then again we do bourbon steward program at the distillery where I'll spend an hour. We're in the lab actually looking at all the things we're doing in the lab relative to quality assurance on our batches. So we talk a lot about what metrics do we want to look at on the grains, what kind of metrics do we look at on grain processing, particle size of the milling, mashing temperatures and starch conversion to fermentable sugars, contamination, fermentation, yeast, all that kind of stuff.
Man, that's incredible. So the next time someone wanders up and tells us that making bourbon is easy, I'm just going to point them to this YouTube link and they can figure it out for themselves. But this is a huge rabbit hole. I love it. This has been one of our most informational, most down the rabbit hole segments yet. And I don't know about you, John, but I'm loving every second of it.
Absolutely, man. This is really fun. I really dig some of the questions coming out of the chat too, and how we're able to kind of just throw it over to Dr. Pat and just let him tear it open and just kind of expose the underbelly of some of these things that we wouldn't otherwise have a whole lot of exposure to.
Definitely. Well, we are kind of rolling up. I think I would, if you're open to it, we'd love to have you back for a 201 at some point, Dr. Pat, but we won't take up your whole night. If people want to know more about you, they want to know more about Ferm Solutions, they want to know more about Wilderness Trail, where should they expect to find you other than rolling up to Danville?
Well, obviously, we're in a lot of the social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, those kind of things. We have a very robust website. I highly encourage anyone to join our family tree program. It's kind of like our ambassador program. We send out monthly newsletters that has, information and different things about what's coming up and any events that we're doing or special releases. Also, we encourage people. I mean, we got people sending in pictures from the Swedish archipelago to the Falkland Islands, Wilderness Trail bottles next to a group of penguins. So we put that kind of stuff in there as well. So it's a really cool way to keep in touch with us. And then, if anybody ever wants to get in touch, we're always, at least at this point of the game, we haven't got to the point to where we're trying to dodge anybody yet. But you can if you get on Google and put in Pat Heist cell phone, it'll probably pop right up, to be quite honest with you. So if you ever need a lifeline on a bourbon argument, don't hesitate to reach out.
Oh,
Holy
man.
shit, I might take you up on that.
Yeah, I can see you getting a late night call from John. Cool. Well, Dr. Pat, thank you again so much. For everyone who's watching, once again, it's good to be back after our summer vacation here on Weekly Whiskey. If you're looking for more from John, you can find him at thebourbonfinder.com. He's doing reviews, articles, all sorts of cool stuff. You can find more from me over at whiskeyraiders.com. And if you're looking for more of Weekly Whiskey, find us here on Thursday mornings for After Hours, every Tuesday night live. Dr. Pat, this was great. This was a schooling in things that I never expected we'd dive into, and I can't thank you enough for your time.
My pleasure.
Cool. Well, thank you again. Cheers, and we'll see you in the green room, my friend.
Cheers, guys.